The wind slashed his face, but he barely noticed. His thighs clamped around his horse, his grip on the reins ironclad as his steed devoured the earth beneath it. Ahead, his quarry fled in a desperate, ragged formation, a handful of Dai Viet officials, their horses struggling to outrun the inevitable. Victory was seconds away. He twisted in the saddle, bellowing, "Faster! Just a little more, and this war, this exhausting, humiliating war, would finally end with one captured king neatly gift-wrapped for the Khan." The Mongol riders fanned out, bows raised. No need for precision. Mongol arrows didn't miss. A twang, a shriek, and a horse collapsed. The chase was over. He leapt from his mount, storming toward the fallen enemy. Fingers seized a battered helmet, yanked it free. This was it. He was about to stare into the defeated eyes of the Dai Viet king himself. But then his gut twisted. This wasn't the king. A slow, creeping smirk spread across the sweaty, caked-in-dust's face. A horse thundered onto the scene, its rider breathless. "Wildly, Commander! Urgent news from the coast! The king! He's not here! He's escaping by sea!" Silence. The sea, miles away, impossible. His men stood frozen, the weight of exhaustion of the past days, chasing rage and realization, crashing over them like an avalanche. They'd been played. But how? To answer that, we need to go back a few months, over 3 months ago. The Mongols, or as we should be calling them now, the Yuan army, decided to make their way into Dai Viet. They were like, "Hey, we've conquered the biggest place in the neighborhood. Why not take a swing at this little chunk of land?" They brought the whole package: mounted cavalry, battle-hardened warriors, and ships, lots of ships. They came in 3 directions like a triple threat attack. The first 2 of these groups were basically on a wild goose chase, duking it out with Dai Viet's defenders in a tense standoff. But that third group, it was coming in hot from the south, all the way from Champa, a kingdom that, if you ask me, probably wished it had a better neighborhood to be in at that point. This army, what was left of it after an exhausting showdown in Champa, wasn't exactly feeling fresh. They were tired, hungry, and probably dreaming of a good nap. Originally, they had 100,000 troops. Now that number had dropped to just over 80,000. Still, that was a lot of troops for Dai Viet to deal with. Leading this weary but formidable force was Sugetu. This guy was skilled. He had elite naval forces backing him up, so he knew how to handle a few waves of opposition, both literally and figuratively. Dai Viet needed a response that matched the Yuan's power, something to break the vice that was squeezing from the south. So Dai Viet had to come up with a plan that would make the most out of what they had left and hopefully turn the tide. If you're enjoying this as much as we are, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Let's hit 15,000 together and keep peeling back history's greatest twists and turns. All right, back to the action. They already had their military forces scattered across southern key locations with Tran Quoc Tuong in charge. Then, as the southern conflict started picking up speed, the Tran court decided maybe we should beef up the defense a little. So they sent in Tran Kien with 10,000 troops to support. But here's where things get a little complicated. Tran Quoc Tuong, bless him, is kind of like that manager who got promoted because they've been around for forever but doesn't exactly have the best skills for the job. Meanwhile, the legendary Sugetu on the Mongol side was practically born with a sword in hand, and his battle skills were no joke. Then there's Tran Kien, this guy, a walking contradiction. He knew the ins and outs of military strategy. He's practically walking around with a library of military tactics in his head. But he had a bit of a grudge against the court. Instead of rallying the troops and making things happen, he basically took a seat and watched as the situation got worse. Meanwhile, Sugetu, like a force of nature, keeps advancing. Tran Quoc Tuong, realizing things were getting messier, starts pulling his forces back toward Than Hoa. Let's get out of here before things go sideways. Move! So now the Tran are hunkering down, hoping the mountain passes and rivers will save them from being steamrolled by an army that doesn't know the meaning of slow down. Now, back at Thanglong, Duat, our seasoned yet slightly underpowered general, was finally catching his breath, as any sane person would, after barely surviving one of the UN's three-pronged attacks. But before he could even finish a bowl of rice, the dreaded call came in. "Pack up, you're needed on the southern front." No rest for the weary. So off he went, straight back into the chaos. Meanwhile, Sogetu, the Mongol general, rolled into Ney ready for a fight. Duat rushed to intercept, setting the stage for what should have been a dramatic showdown. Should have been, because just when he needed reinforcements the most, Twang and Kien, his so-called backup, were nowhere to be found. Outnumbered and outgunned, Duat had no choice but to retreat. Twang, the actual brains behind Dai Viet's defense, took one look at this lackluster performance and said, "Yeah, we're going to need someone who actually knows what they're doing." So he put in a request to the king for a more capable commander. Enter Du. So on March 5th, 1285, Du saddled up with reinforcements and charged straight into battle. At this point you had to wonder, was Sogetu the final boss of Dai Viet, the kind of enemy that made you double-check if you were accidentally playing on nightmare difficulty? Because so far it had taken 4 generals to fight this guy. That was nearly half of Dai Viet's entire command structure dedicated to stopping one Mongol general. And just when Dai Viet thought things couldn't get worse, before Du even reached the battlefield, bad news hit. Kien turned traitor. He took over 10,000 troops, plus his whole family, and straight into Su's open arms, handing the Mongols a perfect roadmap to attack Thang Hoa. Oh, and did I mention Kien and Twang were father and son? That's right. When we said he took his whole family, we literally mean he also brought his father, the very man who had once been in charge of defending the southern border, a man who knew all of the defensive weak spots, and his son, a brilliant military mind who was almost as skilled as Twang, except for one tiny little detail. He chose a different path. Yeah, that's the level of disaster we're talking about. With superior numbers and Kien playing the best or worst, depending on who you ask, tour guide, the Mongols wasted no time. They regrouped, picked up speed, and for the first time Dai Viet was fighting Mongols who could swim. The UN army wasn't just galloping across the land at lightning speed. They were swimming across Dai Viet rivers and seas, ambushing villages left and right. Land was taken piece by piece, and every small DV force sent to slow down Su was now being wiped out completely. But just when it seemed like Dai Viet was running out of options, Du finally arrived. This time, he brought an entire army, a big one, nearly 100,000 troops. That was more than Su's forces, which had been worn down from months of brutal fighting. Just as Du's forces were pulling up to shore, Ken pointed Sot to right to their most vulnerable spot, and on March 13th, 1285, Sogetu and his men launched a surprise attack as Dai Viet troops were still getting off their boats. The Viet's men stepped out for some fresh air and immediately got ambushed. Duat, and the rest of Dai Viet commanders fought back hard, but the Mongols had the upper hand with the element of surprise on their side. They pushed forward, and despite Dai Viet's resilience, the losses started piling up. Generals were falling, the front lines were crumbling, and at this point, sticking around would have been about as smart as challenging a Mongol cavalry charge to a foot race. So Dai Viet did the only logical thing. They pulled back, and that meant trouble. Su steamrolled his way through, because nothing was stopping him from linking up with Prince Togon in the north. The floodgates were wide open, and Soretu had a clear path straight into Dai Viet's heartland. To make matters worse, it wasn't just Mongol troops marching north. There was a whole caravan of defectors, some former Song officials who had fled to Dai Viet for safety. Yeah. Now they were suddenly on Team Yuan, along with a bunch of local officials and their families. Over 400 people in total decided to go with the guys currently winning. Du, knew this wasn't the time for reckless heroics. He tucked his army away in strategic coastal positions, keeping an eye out for the right moment to strike. Then, with a portion of his forces, he made his way back to Thang Truong to regroup with King Tran and Tran Quoc Tuong, because if there was anyone who could turn the tide of this war, it was them. While General Tran Kandu was busy trading blows with Swatu in Tan Hoa, things were heating up elsewhere, over in the Red River Delta. King Tran wasn't just sitting around, he was getting ready to hit back. The plan, a full-scale counterattack aimed right at Toon's forces. This was a well-thought-out move based on some serious advantages. The Dai Viet forces still controlled the eastern coastal waters of the Red River Delta, giving them a huge strategic edge. Not only did they have secure supply lines, but they had stockpiles of resources scattered across the country because, let's be real, they'd been planning for this kind of war way ahead of time. More than that, Tran Quoc Tuong had took part of his army up north to reclaim Van Keep. And let's just say, the Mongols weren't thrilled. Their commander, Arik Kaya, described their situation to Kublai Khan as being stuck awkwardly in the middle, which is just a polite way of saying, we have no idea what to do. Now see, by this point, the Yuan army wasn't the same overwhelming force it had been at the start of the invasion. Back then, they had all the momentum, a massive, concentrated army pushing deep into Dai Viet. But after months of fighting, with their forces spread thin to control captured territory and guard supply lines, the Yuan troops were stretched like a rubber band, ready to snap. They had to constantly fend off ambushes and raids from local resistance fighters, making logistics a nightmare. Supplies were running low, medicine was scarce, and morale, let's just say there weren't a lot of motivational speeches being given in the Mongol camp. Keeping everything running smoothly was easier said than done. Seeing an opportunity, King Tran Nantong decided it was go time. He launched a bold counterattack from Thang Long, sending his troops up the Red River with one goal: smash Togun's forces and take back Thang Long. But as they say, timing is everything, and this counteroffensive may be a little too soon. Sure, Togun's army was having a rough time, but they weren't exactly down for the count. And while the Mongols were losing steam, So's forces in Tan Hoa were still crushing it. So the moment the Tran army made their move, Togun hit the panic button and mobilized everything he had. The two sides clashed hard at Hammam on March 10th, 1285. The Mongols had been itching for a full-scale battle with Dai Viet's main forces, and when the fight kicked off, they hit back hard. The Tran army struggled to keep up, and seeing the risk of a catastrophic loss, King Tran Nantong made the tough call to fall back to Thang Long. Now we get to the part where Soit strolled into the war zone, battle-worn, decked out in elite troops, and absolutely starving. See, punching your way through enemy lines and chasing armies across entire kingdoms is a serious calorie burn. And after months of brawling in Champa and southern Viet, his army wasn't just tired, they were running on fumes. Have you ever tried making good decisions while hangry? You can't even pick a Netflix show when you're starving, let alone fight a war. Honestly, the fact that they made it this far without collapsing into a collective food coma, incredible. Now the plan was simple: link up with Toon, grab a bite, hopefully something more substantial than jungle roots and desperation, and then get back to the business of conquest. With Sagu beefing up the army at Truong Yen, Togun had all the firepower he needed. So when Togun stormed into Thang Long, expecting one final glorious clash, he found nothing: no battered Tran forces waiting for a last stand, no frantic retreating army, just empty space and the sound of waves lapping the shore. It was like they had teleported out of existence. Togun was left with nothing but a giant headache. Where did they go? North? South? Back to the mountains? Into the sea? Heck, were they just watching from the trees and laughing? Every possible lead meant another detour, another delay, and worst of all, a scattered army losing its advantage. Furious, Togen sent out his best officers on what could only be described as the worst scavenger hunt in history. They combed the coastline from Truongyen, modern-day Ninh, all the way up to Guangdong, China, chasing one rumor after another. But the Tran weren't just hiding, they were playing mind games. Reports started flooding in. The royal fleet was spotted at Ngoksun. No, wait, they were seen at Tam Trek. Actually, some say they fled even farther north. At this point, Togen probably considered flipping a coin. Frustrated, he split his forces in two, hoping to cover more ground. It was a solid plan, except for one problem. They were still way too slow. The Mongols were an unstoppable force on land, but on water, let's just say naval warfare, wasn't exactly their thing. By the time they finally reached Tam Kok on April 15, 1285, their grand discovery was a bunch of abandoned ships. The Tran fleet had already disappeared. Again. The Mongols had too many boats and not enough sailors. They weren't a navy. They weren't pirates. What were they supposed to do with all these captured vessels? Row in circles until they got lucky. Realizing they were hauling around a floating junkyard, they had to start sinking their own prizes just to lighten the load. At this point, Togen had to be losing his mind. The Tran court had vanished into thin air. Intelligence was a mess. And despite all the betrayals and captured informants, no one seemed to know where the Vietnamese leaders actually were. How? How did an entire royal court just disappear? There were spies, there were defectors, there were desperate soldiers looking for information. Heck, some Viet nobles had even switched sides, surrendering themselves and their entire families to the Mongols. This guy had been planning his betrayal before the invasion even started. He was convinced he was a genius destined to rule. And when that didn't happen, he decided, fine, I'll just call the Mongols and let them hand me the throne. He had even secretly sent letters through merchants to beg the Yuan court to invade. And then there was Tranish Tak, the Benedict Arnold of Dai Viet. This guy had been planning his betrayal before the invasion even started. He was convinced he was a genius destined to rule, and when that didn't happen, he decided, fine, I'll just call the Mongols and let them hand me the throne. He had even secretly sent letters through merchants to beg the Yuan court to invade. With the Mongols at his doorstep, Tran Ich Tak took his whole family and ran, and straight into Toon's arms. Instead, the Mongols just saw another sniveling noble hoping to profit off a conquest that wasn't even finished yet. And despite all these turncoats handing over spies, defectors, detailed maps and enough traitors, somehow the Mongols were still flying blind. So why was every lead a dead end? You might be wondering, how did this happen? Let's flip the script for a moment. Quoc Tuong wasn't wasting a second. Word got to him fast. His king was in trouble, and if they didn't move right now, the Tran court would be toast. No time for strategy meetings. No time for a morale-boosting speech. He just abandoned Van Keep on the spot and went full throttle south. There might not be a Dai Viet left to save. The Mongols were thundering forward like an out-of-control freight train. They were everywhere, unstoppable, and gaining ground fast. Meanwhile, the Tran fleet, smashed morale hanging by a thread, panic levels somewhere between mildly alarming and full-on existential crisis. With Mongol forces closing in and time running out, the Tran court needed a miracle, or at least one really clever escape plan. And that's when Tran Quoc Tuong played his ace, the sea. Why not just stick to the usual playbook? Split up, regroup, ambush, repeat. It had worked before, so why not now? What do you think? Was this a brilliant strategic shift or a desperate gamble? Let us know in the comments. Now, let's get back to the chase. They staged a grand retreat through the Jia Hai estuary, modern-day Nam Dinh, but left behind a decoy fleet. That's right. They sailed empty royal boats in the complete opposite direction, a perfectly staged illusion designed to send the Mongols on a wild goose chase. And guess what? It worked. The Yuans followed the ghost fleet northward, fully convinced they were closing in for the kill. Meanwhile, the actual Tran army was chilling in Haiduong, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. On April 7th, 1285, the Viet King and his forces ditched their ships at Tam Kok and went full ninja mode, marching overland to Thuyen, where, surprise, surprise, a fresh fleet of perfectly prepped warships was waiting for them. And just when the Mongols finally arrived at Tam Kok, swords drawn, thinking they had cornered their prey, crickets, not a single Tran soldier in sight. The Tran were already 8 days ahead, chilling on boats and sailing straight for Tan. Realizing they'd been duped, the Yuan doubled down. They marched 3 days and 3 nights straight, fueled purely by rage and regret, in a last-ditch effort to catch up. By the time they stumbled into Thuyen, looking like extras from a zombie movie, they probably expected to see a triumphant army waiting for them. Instead, they got more empty space, because by that point, the Tran were long gone, off at sea, cruising toward Thao, which conveniently was now a ghost town since Mongol General Soet had already passed through. The king and the emperor emeritus were constantly on the move, enduring hardships that made royal life look more like a survival reality show. They were constantly on the move, sleeping in the wilderness, dodging enemies left and right. You'd think by this point the royal court would trust Tran Quang completely. I mean, how many times does a guy have to save an entire country before people stop side-eyeing him? This man had saved their hides time and again, pulled off impossible victories, and personally ensured the royal family didn't end up as an unfortunate footnote in Yuan history. And yet, even after personally dragging the entire royal bloodline out of the closest call ever with the Yuan army, some people still found a way to be suspicious. Oh, because of a stick. Because trekking through jungles and battlefields isn't exactly a walk in the park, the man had a walking stick. Practical, sturdy, and very useful for not tripping over roots while plotting the empire's comeback. But his stick had an iron tip. Why? Because in a war zone, efficiency is key. Why waste time unsheathing a sword when with just one good swing, problem solved? Seemed logical, except to the court. At that very moment, some officials were already stressed out of their minds. They'd been running for their lives for way too long. They were exhausted. And now they saw Quang Tuong carrying what basically looked like an assassin tool. You see, Quang Tuong's backstory wasn't exactly a bedtime fairy tale. Check our part 1 for the full drama. Long story short, he had a complicated past with the royal family. At one point, people even wondered if he might challenge the throne. And now, here he was. He held more power than anyone else. He was the only reason the dynasty was still standing. And that terrified them, because when one man is the reason you're alive, he also has the power to decide otherwise. They couldn't do anything to stop him, but they also couldn't sleep at night. Did Quang Tuong notice all this? Oh, you bet he did. He just quietly removed the iron tip, because in the end, Tran Quang Tuong didn't need an iron tip stick to hold power. He already had something stronger, the respect of an entire nation. But that left one tiny problem for the king. How do you make sure you are still the king when your top general is basically the human embodiment of a victory montage? If the commander mastered the art of war, the king mastered the art of the mind. King Tran Nan Tong was working on something just as important, keeping his army from collectively deciding that Mongol rule might not be the worst thing in the world, if it meant they could stop running for 5 minutes. Morale was not great, to say the least, because let's be real, getting chased across the country by the most terrifying empire in history is not a great time. In that instant, the Tran forces had retreated to the south, exhausted, bruised, and questioning every life decision that led them here. They needed something to lift their spirits. So what did the king do? As they sailed south to regroup, he ordered a poem to be carved into the back of his royal boat, one referencing a legendary comeback story from ancient China. The poem told of a king whose country had been surrounded with only 5,000 men left, the odds terrible. But instead of waving the white flag, he flipped the script, rallied his forces, and took back his entire kingdom. Nothing says, "Trust me, I got this," like literally carving your battle plan into the vehicle, carrying you toward your comeback. And in a time when morale was at rock bottom, it worked. The troops straightened their backs, their doubts eased, and the idea of a comeback didn't seem so impossible anymore. As long as the soldiers believed they could still win, they hadn't lost yet.